So I didn't really feel this way too much when DivineZ was first announced, but I think I'm starting to develop a bit of a favorite somewhere here. And you know, it doesn't just end at the merch. Also, the energy cards I've bought are kind of all now. And even though I have a carton right here that I'm going to open up on Twitch pretty soon after this video goes up, I also already bought a silver rare Varga, so help. Anyway, welcome everyone to today's video. We're going to be talking about divine skills. I've been wanting to do a video where we compare all of the so far released divine skills, and of course with set 1 coming out today in Japan, I thought it is no time better than right now. And as I mentioned before, you might want to follow my Twitch channel to be notified of when I go live with my case opening for DZBT01. Praying for a secret in here, really hoping for one because they look really bombastic this time. But in case you don't know what a divine skill is, divine skills are of course a new mechanic introduced in DZBT01, which are basically once per game abilities that have been given out so far to Brancate, Dragon Empire, Keter Sanctuary, and Lyrical Monasterio, with the remaining 2 that were missing coming out in set 2 for Dark States and Stoicheia. The divine skills overall are really cool, and I think that I personally really like once per game mechanics, and especially in games like DifferentFight or even Vanguard in the past. We've had like Zeroth dragons, and progenitors weren't once per game, but kind of. But we have had once per game mechanics, but in a lot of these games, the once per game mechanics tended to be really powerful, like finishing moves that you kind of like stake your whole game on. But I'm a much bigger fan of some of the latter once per game mechanics of Pokemon TCG, where Pokemon TCG had GX attacks initially, which were also once per game attacks you could use, but they were also kind of like finish the game with this quick move or make winning much easier. And I'm not too big a fan of those because it just means you need to use this one effect once per game and suddenly you have a huge advantage. And then it kind of ends up being that like the whole game revolves around that skill, which I think is not very fun. I prefer things like V-Star power in the Pokemon TCG, which were usually utility effects that let you do something once per game. So for example, you had an Arceus card that let you search 2 cards from your deck anytime in the game once per game, which was a really good utility setup. Palkia V-Star allowed you to set up resources on your field very easily, so it's almost like if we had like a Stoicheia one that revived 3 cards from drop as a divine skill, or like maybe like revive 2 and added 2 to your hand from your drop or something like that. There's of course other ones that are like gain an extra turn, which require a lot of setup, but basically there were a lot more utility than just like straight up punch your opponent in the face. Except for Giratina V-Star, I guess. But so when we knew that we're getting divine skills, I was really hoping for a couple things. One is that they're utility based and they're not just like strong once per game moves that kind of finish the game like, you know, Zeroth did, but also that the nations get more than 1, or that if nations do get only 1 per nation, that they are relatively generic and easy to use across the nation in multiple decks. But then when we found out that they're going to be the boss units, I was like, well, that doesn't seem like it's going to be the case. Are they going to be distributing a bunch of different boss units with divine skills, or are they going to be making something like orders with like having like 1 skill that you can use normally and then another skill that's like a divine skill that you can use once per game, which I wouldn't be too surprised if they do that down the line. I think a Gabuelius themed order that can go into any deck being, you know, a divine skill haver wouldn't be too far-fetched. But anyway, the divine skill reveal started to happen, and that's why I decided that I want to rate them, because I think that they all have different standout options, and I think I want to rate them in 2 different ways. One is how those skills rate amongst just the divine skills themselves. So just like divine skill in like a specific box itself, not related to the rest of what the deck does that grade 3 provides the divine skill. And then of course, how the divine skill functions within the deck it's supposed to support, or the nation if it is something that can be applied to the nation. And so then they revealed the very first one, which was Wstra Blitz arms. So while Wstra's first skill of course kind of kept that operation thing going on attack, the first skill immediately was kind of undoing that generic hope of mine, where it essentially sets 2 products from your hand for the cost of CB1 at the same time, and then if you set 2, you get to operate one of them. So it's basically a way to make that deck go faster, and it's basically an ability that you want to fire off on turn 3 no matter what. So it just kind of felt like it's like, okay, this is a utility skill. It's not something that wants to be like used to like punch your opponent in the face. So I was happy about the utility part of it, but I was not so happy about the fact that this doesn't really do anything in the rest of Brancate outside of the Wstra deck. So that's where I was a little bit disappointed, I suppose, but at the same time, the card itself is really good. So it's like if I have to put Wstra alongside like the other divine skills themselves, just like divine skills in a vacuum, I think it probably would be like 3rd lowest, if not lowest, because it is not a generic skill. It is just something that functions to support a deck. So it's the same as Wstra is getting any other support that says once per game. But in terms of what it does for the deck, it's really good. So I think amongst the 4 divine skills, I would say it would be 3rd in that case. I do wonder if they're going to make more divine skills for Brancate in order to compensate for this, because I feel like Brancate could use something a bit more generic, and I wonder what they would would do. Like, just the ability to deck search for orders across all of the rank gate decks might be a good one, or maybe to make up for something that the deck doesn't do already, right? So for example, the Keter one doesn't really do superior calling or anything, but it suddenly encapsulates this Angel Feather mechanic into it, which I think is also very cool. But anyway, so that's Wstra. In my opinion, the most interesting one is of course Keter Sanctuary's Resel. So Resel itself is technically a Keter Sanctuary boss unit that, you know, has the on-attack skill to basically call 2 cards whose grades that you call are restricted by your cards and damage. So for example, if you have 5 damage, you can call like a grade 3 and a grade 2. So if you have 4, you can call like a grade 2 and like a 1. So it does allow you to make 5 attacks, which is pretty strong. But of course, the Divine skill is the most important one. The Divine skill here is, in my opinion, the most creative one, and also one that I really want to pick your brain about. Because this one lets you Soul Blast 1 to put all the critical triggers in your drop zone back into your deck, which is already very huge, and then gain an extra drive for that turn, and then give yourself the skill that when you would damage check a non-heal trigger for your 5th or more damage check, so basically when you would 6 damage, if it's anything but a heal, so if it's a crit, draw, front, or OT, you get to treat it as a heal trigger, which is really, really huge and very creative and adds that kind of like Angel Feather mechanic into it. Now, the thing is that I want to talk about is that this is already very cool as a boss unit, because this isn't a skill unlike Wstra that you just want to fire off on turn 3 and just go ham immediately. This is a skill that you probably want to wait until like turn 4, maybe 5 if you get to that point, because you want to wait till you've actually gotten most of your crits out of your deck, guarded with them, and then your deck is basically nothing except for, you know, not having crits in it. And then, you know, you're go from low deck state into, you know, basically like maybe 10 cards or even 7 cards with like a bunch of crits in there. You're triple driving, so you also have a high chance of checking those crits and a high chance of 6 damage healing and getting that miracle. But I think while this card is really good within its own deck, if you try to build around this card, Resel itself, I think that this is the first card that feels like we're making a return to OG Vanguard, such as like back when in the very first early days, we used to have a deck based around Kingdom Knights Alfred, where he would call out your rear guards, power up himself and all that kind of stuff. And then you'd build up Soul to go into Soul Saver Dragon that would then, once per game usually, blast out a bunch of Soul, power up your board, and then go ham on face and try to win the game that turn. And then because you'd run out of Soul, it would be kind of a vanilla, so you'd have to ride over something else. Resel does state you cannot ride anything but Resel after you use this divine skill, but that technically means that you could, for example, in Youthburg, go through full blast a bunch of times, and then after you're out of your resources and low on deck, go into Resel. Now you can't ride anything but Resel, but you get to put all the crits back into your deck, suddenly have enough cards in deck to fight again. You're going to be checking triggers like crazy, and his on-attack skill, because you're probably at 5 damage, is also going to allow you to still call out good cards. So in the case of Youthburg, of course, you know, you might be playing some archetype specific grade 2s and 3s, etc. But you're still making 5 attacks while checking a lot of triggers, so of course that's also a big important point. And your opponent might be out of resources in the first place, so that might be what it takes to finish them off. You could also even do this in Bastion, for example, and call a grade 3 as well as the Sapien Owl, and there you go, you're doing pretty good too. So I think that not so much necessarily building around Resel itself, we might see quite a lot of Keter decks that from now on just splash like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 Resels in the deck, because now we have the added deck space from the 50 card main decks, and I feel like this card, just everything about it is so generic, it's like you might as well include it. If it means that your long game centered deck can suddenly now survive and actually go into this alternate finisher, I think that's really cool. And I know a lot of people complain that D-Series was like, oh, you're always in the same Vanguard because of Persona, right? I feel like this is the first time they're stepping away from that and giving us this very interesting deck building choice too. So for me, just in terms of what the Divine skill brings to the game, I think this is my favorite one by far. The deck itself for now seems okay at best, so I think that it's gonna get more support because it's our main character, of course, and I'm sure we'll get a new Resel form at some point too, or something along those lines, you know, it's a protagonist and all. But just this card in a vacuum and this Divine skill in a vacuum, I think is really, really cool. And now we move on to, I guess, my new waifu. It seems like I have a thing for adult Vanguard characters that show their belly button. But anyway, midriffs aside, let's talk about Varga Drag Race. It's easy to remember Varga's name because it sounds like Garga from Buddy Fight, and so therefore now you also always remember that it's Varga, not Vagra. So anyway, Varga itself is a pretty cool boss unit. It's kind of like a mini Overlord, so some people were complaining it's like, oh, not another Overlord, but it looks so cool. It's got 2 swords, one of them is white, the other one's black. It's like, it's so anime. But Varga does have the first skill that basically when it attacks the Vanguard, you CB1 and you're able to immediately wipe out both players' front rows, which is really good against, you know, wiping out your opponent's front row and also triggering your own on retire effects and anything else you might have there. It also gets that plus 10k and then stands losing its 2 drive checks. So the second attack is always 0 drives, and it's important to point out here that this card does not work with the Dragon Empire OT whatsoever. It is actively against the Dragon Empire OT, and it's not the first one because I believe Zlands also didn't work with the Dragon Empire OT. So you're kind of forced to run the red or blue one, and I'm not sure which one is the better one of them, but for a restanding deck, maybe the blue one is better because you get to add the extra crit to the Vanguard. But so just keep that in mind. But then of course the Divine skill does say it kind of works in conjunction. It has to attack a grade 3 or greater unit at the end of that battle. Your opponent has to be on 4 more damage, which means you're kind of like incentivized to aggro your opponent down a bit, and you do have to attack with this unit twice before using this. So you have to have used the first skill in order for the Divine skill to activate, and then you CB1 to stand it and gain 2 drives back. So you go basically 2 drives, 0 drives, 2 drives. You could hypothetically risk it and attack with not using the first skill, check drag Veda, restand, attack for 2 drives, and then use the skill to attack for 4 drives. But you're likely going to get accused of stacking for doing that, so let's not do that. But so the Divine skill on its own seems like it's also pretty good because it's a Vanguard restand. And this also offers decks like Vstra that only have 3 attacks to suddenly go like, psych, I go into Varga and suddenly I'm swinging at you with 3 attacks. Of course, the power is much lower and your trick wounds are turned off and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, if your opponent's already low in resources and they're kind of out of PGs from blocking your Vstra all the time, this could be what finishes them off. So it feels like it could also be a generic inclusion into other Dragon Empire decks. But I do think that this card, especially when you look at its support, feels like it's something that wants to be built around more than it is something to be splashed into. So I feel like Varga in particular has some really insane support cards that allow you to do up to 7 attacks. So I think that for that reason, it might be a bit harder to splash, but it's still kind of open for that splashing. So for me, within the deck itself, that's probably the best one of them because it really just works really well in conjunction with the rest of the cards. But then when it comes to the Divine skill on its own, I would put it after Resel in second. And the final one that was revealed very recently is of course Chris Rain. Chris Rain is the lyrical Monasterio one, and initially people weren't sure what to expect. The art, of course, is very much a banger, but the first skill ended up being a Highlander deck where you are basically rewarded for using cards of different names. So our skill lets you CB1 and choose one of the 3 skills to use, which is either draw a card at energy charge 3, or get plus 15k power to one of your units, or give her an extra crit. And oftentimes you're giving the plus 15k to herself, I think, or you can also distribute it depending on how you want to threaten your opponent. But if you have 4 more different name units on your board, which means your Vanguard plus 3 rearguards, then you get to use 2 of those effects. But if you have 5 different units, so your Vanguard and 4 different rearguards, then you get to use all 3 of those effects in 1 CB, which of course is what you're aiming for. You should be building your deck with that in mind. It does have some really good support cards too, which you want to be running as a 4 of, and also there's some good generics in Lyrical you probably want to be running in multiple copies too. But other than that, you probably do want to be running 1 or 2 ofs across the board just to kind of like satisfy the skill. But the Divine skill is the one where I was like, oh man, her multi-attack is locked behind this. So on attack to a grade 3 or greater unit, you get to basically at the end of the battle bounce all of your rearguards back to your hand and then call 1 card from your hand, and then that card will copy the power and crit of your Vanguard. So if you use the first skill of Chris Rain and give herself the 15k and of course gain the crit, then that rearguard will copy it and be at least a 28k, or usually you're going to be using that skill on turn 4 when you've persona ridden. So usually it's going to be a 28k with the extra crit, or 38k rather with the extra crit at the very least. And then also procs any of their on play effects too, and you do have ways to make that 5th attack off of this too. Now the only thing is that of course this multi-attack is gated to once per game, but I guess when your Vanguard is doing 28k with a crit on most turns, it's kind of like hitting Vstra numbers with a good booster. And the deck also has a booster that guard restricts your opponent with a new form of guard restrict that's even better than Battledore in my opinion. So for that reason, I do think Chris Rain is actually better than people expect. And like Philip says in his video that's probably not uploaded yet, it's oftentimes the simplest looking cards that can be the best. The Divine skill on its own, I think, could be used in other decks, but it's like the thing is that a lot of the lyrical decks already have multi-attack. So it's like, is it really worth to go into this and then without persona just like get another attack out like 28k twice? I'm not too sure. I think the splashability of this one feels a little bit lower compared to Resel, because the other lyrical decks just do this better. But for herself, of course, this enables a non-multi-attacking deck to multi-attack, so as you know, having that once per game is fine. Most Vanguard games do tend to just go to like 5 turns or so, so if you use this on a well-timed turn 4 or 5, you only really need it once per game. So I'm very curious to see what the builds will look like for her, but right now it's kind of hard to tell. I feel like as a Divine skill, I would put her not the lowest in terms of like genericity. Sorry, how generic it is what I'm trying to say here. I think that the Wstra one is by far the least generic, so it goes chose bottom of the list for that reason. But in terms of how good it is, it might be the last one. I feel like I would, for how good the like card is as a whole, it kind of does feel like Varga, then a Resel, but it's really buffed by how good the divine skill is, and then Wstra, and then Chris Rain. But it doesn't mean that the difference between Chris Rain and Wstra is that huge. I just think that Wstra is overall better because it also has a lot of previous support from products to work with. But that is my opinion of divine skills and the 4 that we have so far. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below as well. I mean, we're still gonna be waiting for the Stoicheia and Dark States ones, but I'd love to hear what you think of the divine skills and how you would rank them as well. Leave your opinions in the comments below, and of course, if you like the video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. And if you want to support the channel further, consider becoming a YouTube channel member. You get access early to some videos, and I also upload extra bonus content for you guys too. And I even held an event recently for channel members here in Tokyo, so you get a lot of really cool bonuses, and it helps support what I do. The Vanguard World Invitational was basically partially funded by you guys and your channel memberships, and so I'm going to be doing a lot more events like that. And unfortunately, a lot of the expenses do and tend to add up here and there, so your support really does mean a lot. But with that, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.